That part was easy because Jorge locates them in a very localized context, and so they're reacting to very particular circumstances all the time. The economist who works for the International Monetary Fund, I mean, he sends her all over the earth. Right? She's in Africa, and she's dealing with specifically African problems of corruption. She deals with Latin Americans, and he has great fun there because he satirizes some very real people, names we all know. And so the Americans are very American, and they have American preoccupations. They do very American things, and their reading is very American. So each strand of the novel acquires a legitimacy of its own because of the particularity that I don't know how he managed to do this, because the learning involved in the book, the science aspect, all of that is encyclopedic. I mean, I wasn't joking about having to scour Google all the time just to figure out what he was talking about. But the particularities are also very, very specific. I mean, the Russians, when he talks about Arkady's youth, for example, his father is a very important man in the apparatus, well, a shadow man in the apparatus, but nevertheless important in his relationship to power. And so we get a whole study of what it means to be the son of someone like that, and also a scientist, driven to be a superior scientist. The two girls, the two Americans, the one's the economist, one's the activist, but they go to a very specific high school in Philadelphia. They study very specific things. They have very specific experiences. So again, it's the grand novel idea of a world. It isn't just one place, but you get an evocation of a cross-section, as it were, but at the same time, tremendously dense, because you're in the lives of the characters who have real lives, real past, real experiences. So it's a big.
I have a question for you. So I mentioned this in the introduction, but there's kind of 3 books of yours that hit at, or that all deal with history, I guess. Like In Search of Klingsor's is very World War II. Season Mash is the end of the 20th century, and then in between there's El Fin de Locura, the end of madness, which is more 68, right? So did you set out to write these 3 books as one grand project of 20th century history?
Yes, more or less. When I was finishing In Search of Klingsor, that's a book about the Second World War, the German atomic project. I was so amazed and thrilled with the idea of writing a novel like this, mixing real characters, history, science, that I decided at the time to write another 2 books in order to form a sort of trilogy, even if each book can be read without reading the others. It's independent, absolutely. There are not the same characters in these books. But there is a general idea of writing the history of the 20th century through fiction, and always mixing these characters and always mixing discourses that comes from politics, from history, from social sciences, and especially from science. So the first part is about physics especially. The second part that has to deal with the 60s and 70s in France and Latin America is mainly about philosophy and psychoanalysis. And this part is about the 3 sciences that are defining the end of the 20th century and the first part of the 21st century: economics, genetics, and artificial intelligence. So yes, there is more or less a plan for the 3 books. So if you read the 3 books, you can try to understand the 20th century with these main lines but at the same time there are independent and very different novels. For example, in Search of Klingsor and Season of Ash, I decided as a novelist to respect the actual facts. So everything that happens in these two novels has to do with the actual facts, historical facts. But with the End of Madness, that is a comedy. I think that In Search of Klingsor and Season of Ash are tragedies, and the End of Madness is a comedy. So I decided to do the opposite. So in the End of Madness, and that was very strange when it was published in Spanish and other languages, the reception, because I decided to do the opposite. So many things that happens with historical characters in the End of Madness are inventions, and I decided to distort history. That is another way to understand history through fiction, and that's why it is different. The End of Madness, but In Search of Klingsor and Season of Ash are novels that respect the actual history. The characters, the historical characters are always accurate with they done.
Actually, I have another question.
Yeah.
So with the Crack Manifesto, you set out very specifically, and Eloy and Pedro and Nacha, and I forget the person is. Yes, set out specifically to enact a change. I mean, that's why you write a manifesto, to try and make something happen. Do you think you accomplished that?
Yes, well, I think so. I'm not the one to say that, but not only the Crack group, but a lot of writers of my generation in Latin America were struggling against this obligation to write magical realism at the time. At the end of the 80s and the beginning of the 90s, it was almost impossible to be published or translated if you didn't write magical realism, because the huge success of Garcia Marquez and 100 Years of Solitude made a very weird equation. Magical realism became a way to define Latin America, not only a literary source, but a kind of definition of Latin America, as if Latin America could be always a continent where magic and imagination are the norm, and we Latin Americans are aware but not very surprised with all the magic that is around us. So that's the idea that came after this wonderful book that is 100 Years of Solitude and all the other Garcia Marquez books. But at the end of the 80s and the beginning of the 90s, the new generations of Latin American writers wanted to be more free to write everything we wanted at the time, to write about Latin America or to write about other countries with the same legitimacy that any writer in the world has. So for me it was very strange when I published In Search of Klingsor in Spain in 1999, 10 years ago, exactly 10 years ago. And after that, with all the translations of In Search of Klingsor, everywhere I received the same question. Why a Mexican writer writes about Germany? And I always answer them, why not? Why not? If an American writer writes about Mexico or about Germany, never he receives the question, why an American writer is writing about Germany? It's so normal. So why is so eccentric to be a Mexican and write about Germany? If a Frenchman writes about Germany or Mexico, it's the same. It was very normal. And why for Latin Americans it was so unexpected to have a novel about Nazi Germany, for example. And that's what we intended with the Project Manifesto.